Welcome to our channel where we delve into the darkest corners of the human mind. Turn off the lights, sit back, and prepare to be terrified. The old bridge, shrouded in mist, has long been whispered to be haunted. Locals tell tales of a ghostly figure, a solitary silhouette appearing on foggy nights. It is said to be the spirit of a young woman named Eliza, who met a tragic end on that very bridge a century ago. Imagine, if you will, a night like any other. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth, and the silence is broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. A thick fog rolls in, blanketing the old bridge in an eerie silence. The only sound is the gentle lapping of the river below, its murky waters reflecting the moon's pale light. A young man named Thomas, new to the town and unaware of the local legends, found himself drawn to the bridge on just such a night. He was captivated by its old-world charm, its time-worn stones whispering tales of a bygone era. As he stepped onto the bridge, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him like an unseen hand. He paused, his heart pounding in his chest. He could have sworn he saw a figure standing at the far end of the bridge. It was a woman, her form barely discernible in the swirling mist. She seemed to float above the wooden planks, her long white gown flowing around her like tendrils of fog. Thomas rubbed his eyes, unsure if what he was seeing was real or a figment of his imagination. When he looked back, the figure was gone. He chuckled nervously, attributing the apparition to his nerves. He continued walking, his pace quickening with each step. As he neared the spot where he had seen the figure, he heard a soft whisper carried on the wind. "Beware," the voice whispered, its tone filled with a deep, sorrowful longing. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He whirled around, his eyes scanning the empty bridge. The fog seemed to swirl around him now, as if alive, its tendrils reaching out towards him like ghostly fingers. And then he saw her. The woman in white stood directly behind him, her face veiled in shadow, her eyes burning with an unnatural light. Thomas gasped, stumbling backwards in terror. "Who are you?" he stammered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. She simply glided towards him, her feet not seeming to touch the ground. As she drew closer, Thomas could make out the details of her face. It was a face frozen in time, etched with an expression of unspeakable sadness and longing. Her eyes, wide and staring, seemed to bore into his very soul. Thomas felt a cold hand grip his arm, its touch sending a jolt of fear through his entire body. He tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, its icy fingers digging into his flesh. "You will join me," the ghostly figure whispered, her voice a chilling rasp that seemed to echo through the empty night. Thomas screamed, his voice lost in the swirling mist. He thrashed against the ghostly figure's grip, but his efforts were futile. Nestled deep within the woods, shrouded in an almost perpetual cloak of mist, stood an abandoned house. Locals would tell you it was best left undisturbed. The house, they claimed, was not empty. The mist, they said, brought it to life. They spoke of a phantom, a shadowy figure glimpsed through fog-obscured windows, his presence more felt than seen. Now Sarah, a young photographer drawn to forgotten beauty, was captivated by the house's melancholy charm. She saw not a place of fear, but a canvas for her art. One evening, as a thick fog rolled in, she felt an irresistible pull towards the abandoned house. The old iron gates groaned open as if warning her away. Ignoring their ominous creak, she stepped onto the overgrown path, her boots crunching on fallen leaves. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. As she approached the house, its silhouette looming large through the swirling mist, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The windows, like vacant eyes, seemed to follow her every move. Raising her camera, she framed a shot, capturing the house's desolate beauty. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The air inside was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and the only sound was the creaking of the old house settling around her. She moved from room to room, each one frozen in time, filled with the remnants of forgotten lives. A child's doll lay discarded on a dusty rocking horse. A half-finished meal sat on a table set for two. As she reached the top of the grand staircase, she heard a noise. It was a soft sound, like someone sighing, coming from the room at the end of the hall. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her curiosity outweighed her fear. She moved towards the sound, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a dusty old nursery. A rocking horse stood frozen in mid-rock, its chipped paint a haunting reminder of happier times. But it was the figure in the rocking chair by the window that made Sarah's blood run cold. A tall, shadowy figure sat in the chair, his back to her. The figure was shrouded in darkness, his features indistinguishable in the dimly lit room. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. She raised her camera, her finger hovering over the shutter button. "Don't," a voice whispered, its tone laced with a deep sadness. Sarah gasped, dropping her camera to the floor with a thud. Chapter 3. The Mysterious Woman in the Cemetery. The old cemetery, blanketed in a perpetual mist even on the clearest of days, was a place of somber beauty. Towering oaks draped in Spanish moss stood sentinel over weathered headstones, their names and dates obscured by the passage of time. It was said that on the thickest of fog-laden nights, a mysterious woman in gray could be seen, gliding through the cemetery, her face obscured by a veil. Her sorrow, they said, was palpable, a weight that settled over the already heavy air. Daniel, a writer drawn to the melancholy beauty of such places, found himself inexplicably drawn to the cemetery. He had heard the whispers of the woman in gray, dismissed them as local folklore. One evening, as a thick fog rolled in, he found himself standing at the rusted iron gates, a chill running down his spine. He pushed the gates open, their hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and lilies. The fog clung to the ground, swirling around his ankles like restless spirits. He walked along the cobblestone path, his eyes scanning the weathered headstones. He paused before a particularly old grave, its marble cracked and covered in moss. As he brushed away the moss, he noticed the inscription, Eleanor Vance, died at sea, 1888. As he traced the inscription with his fingers, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He looked up, his eyes scanning the fog-shrouded cemetery, and that's when he saw her. A woman in a long gray dress glided through the mist, her head bowed, her face obscured by a veil. She moved with an ethereal grace, her feet seeming not to touch the ground. Daniel stood mesmerized, his breath catching in his throat. He had dismissed the stories of the woman in gray as mere legend, but here she was, before his very eyes. The woman drifted towards him, her sorrow palpable, a heavy weight that settled over him like a shroud. He wanted to look away, to run, but he found himself rooted to the spot, transfixed by her ethereal beauty. As she drew closer, he could see the glimmer of tears beneath her veil, hear the soft whisper of her sobs carried on the wind. She reached out a hand, her touch sending a jolt of icy fear through his body. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a mournful echo in the stillness of the cemetery. "Help me find him." Daniel took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to help her, but he didn't understand. Who was she looking for? He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The woman in gray continued to drift towards him, her sorrow washing over him in waves. "He's lost," she whispered, her voice filled with a deep, abiding sadness. The fog, a veil between worlds, can both conceal and reveal, shrouding us in fear or unveiling the mysteries that lie beyond. Until next time, stay safe and beware of the faces in the fog.